welcome back to my channel. My name is Cole Anderson, and today we're talking about one of my favorite pieces, the Concerto in F by George Gershwin. This piece was Gershwin's second foray into writing for the concert stage after the surprise hit of his Rhapsody in Blue, premiered with Paul Whiteman and his band in Carnegie Hall the year before. It shows a marked step forward for Gershwin from the standpoint of compositional technique, as he not only completely orchestrated the work himself, but he also devised a far more elaborate and satisfying formal structure as well. You might not be aware of it, but it was very uncommon for Broadway composers like Gershwin to orchestrate their own works. They just didn't have time to do that in the preparation for a busy Broadway run. And Gershwin was no exception, although he had studied orchestration and had made a few trials for numbers from his shows. Still, Rhapsody in Blue was prepared so quickly that he had to defer to Paul Whiteman's orchestrator, Freddie Groffet, for the orchestration, which Groffet made, by the way, superlatively. The original jazz band orchestration is amazing. In the Concerto in F, however, maybe in an effort to prove himself as an orchestrator, Gershwin really outdid himself with the beauty of the orchestration. There's a lot of really interesting chamber-like textures that alternate with full orchestral effects, and it's all just really colorful and marvelous. You really do have to hear this piece in its original form to get its full charm and beauty. Hopefully my two-piano version sounds good enough and will give you a good idea about the form and the structure and the musical ideas, but you're definitely missing something if you don't hear that orchestration. And Gershwin obviously enjoyed orchestrating this piece, and as a result, I think he poured so much effort into the orchestration that the piano part sometimes seems a little bit underwritten. So I do fill out a few passages where Gershwin's writing in the piano just doesn't match the richness of the orchestration. I only do it in a few places, and I mark every time it happens, so just wanted to be upfront about that. It almost seems like Gershwin is leaving open space for the performer to kind of fill in a little bit, so I don't feel like it's too much out of place to do that in one or two places. So I said this was a step forward from Rhapsody in Blue, and what did I mean by that? Because Rhapsody in Blue is an inspired piece, but it was prepared so quickly, it kind of represents a kind of guesswork on Gershwin's part. He was in a relative hurry to write it, and he just kind of strung together some really nice ideas, and amazingly, it really works. No doubt that's owing to Gershwin's kind of unerring structural instincts, but he didn't really have the chance to work his ideas out with the kind of sophistication that he really wanted to. That's why he immediately was very excited when he got the commission for this piece from Walter Damrosch. In some ways, the Concerto in F is like a continuation of the Rhapsody because particularly the first movement is structured in a very unique way. It references sonata forms from the 19th century and concerti, the Romantic Concerti in particular by Tchaikovsky or Grieg, but at the same time, it's a very personal reworking, his own personal take on this form. Gershwin also nods his head to past masters like Liszt, Schubert, and Franck in his use of cyclical form, but again, it's kind of unconventional. It's his own take on this form. This is very much a work in which Gershwin was proving his compositional acumen, and in doing so he uses a kind of tightly woven motivic structure, reminiscent of classical sonata works by Haydn or Beethoven, as well as romantic pieces like Liszt's B minor sonata and Schubert's Wanderer Fantasy. The first movement is recognizably a sonata form movement, but it's altered enough that perhaps it would be more fitting to call it a sonata rhapsody. So the first theme is really a collection of small motives that continue to run through the rest of the piece. Gershwin looks back to the standard classical concerto form, exemplified by Mozart or Beethoven, for example, in having this entire lengthy opening section played by the orchestra alone. Then, Gershwin continues in a romantic tradition by having the piano enter right away with an extended solo cadenza, presenting a new theme, which is quite unsettling in its harmonic ambiguity. Even though Gershwin eschewed any kind of program for this piece because he wanted to make the point that he could write absolute music, it wouldn't be hard to kind of imagine the opening section being the hustle and bustle of a big city and the second theme with the piano alone being the individual, kind of lonely and pensive amidst all this clamor and excitement. After this second theme, there's a closing segment, and after that, Gershwin departs from tradition Firstly, by recapping the second theme again, this time with the roles switched so that the piano has the counter melody and the orchestra has the theme, and then also by the way he builds his development section. It's a very unusual development section. The development section takes on the character of an extended sequence of variations, which culminates in this kind of gorgeous E major theme. It's in the same key as the famous theme from Rhapsody in Blue, and it's quite as breathtaking in my opinion. Then there is a recapitulation of sorts, but the themes occur in a different order from the exposition, and they're very much abbreviated and altered. And of course, I mark all these in the video so that you can follow along clearly. It was a shame at the time that this work was alternately written off as being either too ambitious, too bombastic for its material, or, on the other hand, the work of an amateurish composer. And both of these criticisms are ridiculous. I mean, on the first hand, about it being too bombastic, none of these critics who complained about this work being overblown seemed to have any problems enjoying works by Tchaikovsky or Brahms, who wrote things on a similar scale all the time. No, I think it's only because Gershwin was trying to write in a quote-unquote jazzy style. But I think that the form of this work really works perfectly well with the material that Gershwin is working for. It was just prejudice that caused these people to complain about it, since he was doing something a little bit different than what he'd done before in Rhapsody in Blue. And by the way, that's another weird thing about the rhetoric of his day. Gershwin was supposedly a jazz composer. You hear this all the time from his supporters as well as his detractors, along with a lot of kind of condescending posh about how he was lifting jazz up out of the vernacular into the classical sphere, as if jazz needed to be ennobled at all. This is terribly wrong on a couple counts. First off, Gershwin simply wasn't a jazz musician or composer. He was primarily a Broadway composer. That's how he started and gained his enormous success and wealth at first, who then made a very successful transition to writing concert music as well. Concert music which clearly shows its Broadway heritage. Now certainly Gershwin employed all kinds of popular music influences in his compositions, and in particular he did evince an enormous interest in African American vernacular music like blues, ragtime, and spirituals. The most obvious example of that fascination, of course, was his masterpiece, the opera Porgy and Bess. And his music also did share a harmonic and melodic vocabulary with jazz, and also with many other strains of popular music at the time. But you only have to listen to Gershwin play his own pieces. There are numerous recordings of Gershwin on the piano playing his own tunes, and then compare them to versions by authentic jazz artists like Art Tatum or Ella Fitzgerald, for example, to realize what the difference really is. The obvious difference is the lack of elaborate and abstract improvisation, but also Gershwin's whole expressive vocabulary, the sort of turns of phrase and patterns that he used in his playing were really much more drawn from his Broadway roots, with a strong influence, of course, from ragtime and the blues. And Gershwin was well aware of this. Although he was certainly influenced by jazz artists, he knew that he was not actually a jazz musician himself. Now, Gershwin's music obviously entered the repertoire for jazz improvisers. It's become a great favorite ever since his day to the present, but he was not a native jazz composer himself. And it's only important to make that distinction because there were great jazz composers around that time and later, like just to pull some names out of a hat, Duke Ellington, for example, who was experimenting with large-scale forms in a much more authentically jazz way. Or Charlie Parker or Dave Brubeck. All these people were experimenting with jazz compositions that were quite striking. And their works were really designed to fit right into that medium. So it's worth paying attention to that, since many of these composers like Duke Ellington, they suffered a certain amount of marginalization just owing to their race or the venues that they presented their music in. Obviously, jazz needed no ennobling. I think it's pretty obvious now. It didn't need to be rescued from itself. Already at that time in the 1920s, there were genius musicians at work in that field who were already creating works of such complexity and sophistication that it would be pure stubbornness not to recognize that they represented another totally new strain of classical music, largely distinct from the European tradition. Only in the matter of the basic tonal arrangement and the use of extended harmony did European and jazz music really overlap at that time. There were plenty of European composers who were using jazz elements, but I think it would be a stretch to call Ravel's music, for example, even his G major concerto, to call that a jazz concerto. There's influence there, but it's not jazz, really. And certainly influence the other way also occurred as well. I think you can just see that in the use of extended harmony as it became more and more widespread among jazz musicians. But for the most part, the core of jazz really came from the African American vernacular, ragtime, blues, and spirituals. Now, criticism of Gershwin as amateurish is also quite puzzling, really. Maybe it was partly snobbery and partly jealousy. Some of those who criticized the most were ones who you would expect would know better, like none other than Prokofiev, for example, and Virgil Thomson as well, the well-known composer and critic at the time. It's kind of absurd. I mean, you only have to look closely at this piece, and you'll realize that it's an example of a masterful handling of form, and it's marvelously written for all the instruments. Now, granted, Gershwin treats this form in a very unique way, as I was saying, a very personal way. So maybe his critics at the time were objecting to that. Maybe Gershwin should have used a different title for his work instead of concerto. Maybe that was setting up an expectation that he did not end up fulfilling for these critics. But really, that's what I most like about this piece, that it's so personally conceived, that it's so much a product of Gershwin's own uniquely active mind. There's nothing really exactly like it in the history of concerti, before this or after. And it really works. In a good performance, you're just swept along from first note to last. So I think it's best to just set aside any preconceived notions of how a concerto should sound and just enjoy the ride. So thank you very much for watching.